Good evening and welcome. That was Bobbie Louise Hawkins reading at the Poetry Project in 1978. Recently, the Library of Congress completed its digitization of the project's full archive, and one of the great joys of having that material is bringing it back into this room to share with you. Bobbie read here at least 10 times over several decades and was a prolific, beloved teacher. We're very honored to be celebrating her here with you tonight on this perfect spring evening. Listening to these recordings, you can hear Bobbie's intuitive sense of rhyme, more in the sense of emergence than resolution. And maybe a better word than rhyme is resonance. She apprehends distance, proximity, and approach in words, but also in behavior and landscape, how things and people come together, and also how they go. There is a love of horizon in the work. There's also her great affection for the accidental and off-kilter. We hear her ear turned in the writing toward what blips, the places where speech and gesture reveal what is more true. There's a long pause in one of these readings when you can hear everyone shifting in the parish hall. It's sort of unclear what's happening until you hear a dog barking that's wandered into the room, and then you can hear Bobbie sort of next to the microphone just saying, "Come here." It's clear from these recordings that every time Bobbie Louise Hawkins came to town to read and teach, that it was an occasion. And it really is a special occasion to have her and you here with us tonight. I'd like to thank everyone at Lost and Found for bringing work available at the back table. I'd also like to thank Caroline Swanson at Naropa for providing some of those archival images that we just shared. And I'd also like to extend our thanks to Bobbie's family, to Sarah Hall Creeley especially, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, but is very much here in spirit. We're also very grateful to tonight's readers, Laura Henriksen, who will share a contribution from Jennifer Dunbar Dorn, Ambrose Bai, who will share something from Read By, Brenda Koltes, Eleni Sikelianos, Iris Cushing, Barbara Henning with a piece from Lewis Warsh, Julie Patton, Penelope Creeley with remarks from Sarah Hall Creeley, Eileen Miles, and then Ann Waldman. We'll hear personal reflections about Bobbie's friendships and life, as well as some readings of her work. Each reader will introduce the next, and then at the end, we'll hear another recording of Bobbie Louise Hawkins at the project. It's my pleasure now to hand things over to our first reader, Laura Henriksen.
Hi. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight to celebrate the great Bobbie Louise Hawkins. My name's Laura. I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement here at the Poetry Project. And I am also a very devoted Bobbie Louise Hawkins fan and Jennifer Dunbar Dorn fan. So I'm so honored to get to share with you 3 short pieces from Jennifer. The first is a poem by Jennifer Dunbar Dorn called Remembering Bobbie. Remembering Bobbie, I hear her idiosyncratic way of pronouncing half, so it rhymes with Alf. The perfect timing she used in her storytelling, pausing just so to deliver the final mot juste. I remember her piecing together scraps from piles of magazines to make her marvelous collages. I admired her fortitude, her courage in the face of loss and tragedy, her proud demeanor, her famous cheekbones. Bobbie was one of a kind, as they say, coming out of West Texas, inventing herself from scratch, marrying up and taken away to Denmark, London, and the colonies of British Honduras. Next, I'm going to read some selections Jennifer made from One Small Saga, Bobbie's book, and then you'll hear another passage from this book and a little bit from Brenda Koltes. I seemed to myself such an unlikely candidate for so Jane Austen an advantage. He even suggested to my mother that we have a trial marriage. I was impressed enough to say yes on the strength of it. I had only known him for 2 weeks. I was married, all unknowing, by an FBI agent. I never recovered from the social change and the leg up that marriage gave me. For the first time in my life, the vocabulary I got from books and the vocabulary I used in conversation meshed. "You only horrified me once, my dear," Alicia said years later in London. "It was when you came to play tennis and you were wearing black shorts and a red shirt." And the last thing that I will read is a poem Jennifer selected from Bobbie's book, 15 Poems. It's the first poem. A wet day, long ago, lost to all but memory that lights it now. A shadow show. A green day, wet with rain. Odors rose from the ground, pine needles and the shadowed air. It is the clarity of that loss, is the light, brings it back before my eyes, puts the thunder in today's sunshine. And our next reader will be Ambrose Bye. Thank you.
Okay, so this is from my father, read by, and it's called Notes, but this is what it is Notes from Visit to Bobbie Louise Hawkins Writing Workshop, Character and Monologue, Fall 2001. The class began with the showing of an Alan Bennett monologue on video. In its moment-to-moment attention to nuance of speech and character, this made a good focusing start to the class. Following a brief discussion, the students distributed their writing assignments for the week, the beginnings of monologues for 3 separate characters, each taking place at an airport. The students read these works aloud. Bobbie made some initial comments to help establish a good starting line for each monologue and pointed out places where the characters engaged in too much editorializing about themselves, or the use of vocabulary and diction that drew attention away from the character over to the voice or attitude of the writer. Bobbie then went over the assignment for the coming week. Each student will write at least 1 page of backstory material on the character they find most interesting of the 3 and develop that character's airport monologue. Cohort groups were organized to review each other's work over the course of the week. Bobbie explained that this was to enable the students to expand parameters of their characters as initially conceived. Through collaboration with other readers and writers. She spoke of the confinement we impose on our own creations, which might be ventilated if others' suggestions were taken in at certain stages. Bobbie speaks on the art of writing with confidence from years of experience. She is not schooled in critical theory or its jargon, but covers many of the same points discussed in critical academia on her own terms. While it is clearly a drawback at this time to be unfamiliar with certain theoretical frameworks, it can be nevertheless more directly instructive to speak from personal experience in creative writing, and Bobbie gives very practical and real teaching this way. She showed a sharp eye for integrity and a tone in critiquing students' work, and identified without hesitation points where the monologues faltered, offering thoughts on how to adjust elements to regain a lively tone or movement. The class seemed very comfortable with the getting down to work nature of the workshop. They accepted critique gratefully, and the discussion stayed focused and energetic. Bobbie often draws from her rich mental archive of anecdotes to illustrate her points. While speaking of the virtue of surprising turns that short-circuit discursiveness and bring a story to present condition, she ended the class with her paraphrase from a poem by Lou Welch called "Small Sentence to Drive Yourself Sane." In the poem, the next time you are doing something absolutely ordinary, or even better, the next time you are doing something absolutely necessary, such as pissing, or making love, or shaving, or washing the dishes, or the baby, or yourself, or the room, say to yourself, "So it's all come to this." Like, whatever you're doing, Bobbie said, just stop in the middle of it and look around and say to yourself, "So it's all come to this." And I thought I should just give, because he references anecdotes and a couple other things, I thought I should just give a couple because I knew her growing up pretty well. And one of my first experiences with her was probably about 89 or 90. She took me to see The Adventures of Baron von Munchausen with a friend of mine. And I was used to the way my parents drove a car, which was sort of like recklessly passive, I would say. So Bobbie was a little more confident behind the wheel, and we were driving coming down from the university on the hill, if you know Boulder, and some frat boy or something cut us off, and she, looked at this guy, and I mean, to my 9 or 10-year-old ears, she's, looked at him and was like, this dumb motherfucker, or something, that kind of thing. And I just thought that was so cool. I was like, wow, this is a really, I want to hang out with her more and go to more movies. And then 25 years, fast forward 25 years later, my grandmother moves to Colorado, and she was at this retirement place called the Atrium, where Bobbie eventually moved to maybe 2 or 3 years after my grandmother lived. And she was actually kind of my grandmother's last friend. And my grandmother was kind of proper British woman, but she had this dark sense of humor. And so Bobbie was perfect. And I don't know, we were sitting around, and Bobbie was gossiping about some philandering male poet in the community. And she looked at my grandma and said, he's terribly boring, but he fancies himself as a real coxman. And I could see my grandmother kind of light up in this way, like the way that I had when I was younger, just sort of like, wow, she's really cool. I'm going to hang out with her now at the place, and we can talk shit about all of these people together, because my grandmother also loved to gossip. And then my last one was nearer to the end. It was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and we went over, and Bobbie had just come out of this interview with this woman, and I think it was a student, and the interview was fine, but actually when Reed's line of saying that this editorializing about themselves or using the vocabulary and diction that drew attention from the character over the voice or attitude of the writer, it was like the narrative got too much about how difficult Bob was, or how difficult, and she was just, you could tell she felt like she was being kind of turned into this cliche of herself, and she looked at me and just said, with a big Bobbie grin, and said, honey, I was pretty difficult too. Anyway, next up, Brenda Koltes.
Hi. It's great to be able to be here tonight to say thank you to Bobbie for so many wonderful things. My memories of Bobbie, a Texas stroll on the phone before I met her, Anne driving an orange Volvo took me to meet Bobbie, and then Eleni. Utterly charmed, I didn't stand a chance. I was coming to Naropa. Bobbie was not afraid to bust a move. She built the bijou out of her garage, a classroom and a performance space, and sometimes sleeping quarters for Joanne Kiger and Donald Garovich, or whoever was passing through. Always coffee brewing and some sort of construction, like expanding the front window or hiring John Wright, a poetry student, to lay a new brick patio. I think she made up these jobs to give students a little extra money. As students, we sat around a table in the bijou, reading handouts from, say, Richard Brodigan, Margaret Duras, or Fielding Dawson, and particularly Lucia Berlind, who she really championed throughout my whole time there. And I keep thinking in heaven how happy she must be that Lucia received the recognition that Bobbie always thought she deserved. Bobbie treated me as a fellow writer, sharing her struggle with writer's block. She had a novel in progress called Forever, and she got a big kick whenever her computer asked her if she were saving forever. I'm reading a scene from One Small Saga, as Laura mentioned, a semi-autobiographical novella written in 1984. The scene is near the beginning. The narrator has married a Danish man that she has only known for 2 weeks and is about to meet his family. It took just 2 weeks from the day they met for the handsome Dane to marry his young wife and put the two of them aboard a Greyhound bus en route to Africa. They would stop to see his sister, Bertie. They would stop in New York City. They would stop in Denmark. They would stop in London. And then they would take the last leg home. Bertie told Axel the cheap passage she had found to Denmark, an old Swedish liner, the Gripsholm, reclaimed from the boneyard to be a hospital ship during the war, was now a passenger ship for travelers with no grand expectations. Bertie would be on it with her 2 children in 10 days. After Christmas in Denmark, she would go to her own house in London and be joined there by her excellent husband, Gilbert, in mid-January. Gilbert, who never spoke when Bertie was talking, stood at the piano picking out the calypsos with one finger. Axel telephoned. In 10 days, Axel and I would also be aboard the same ship. Axel did not think of himself as capricious. When he was younger, he had, for a bet and a dare, stripped naked and jumped off the railing of a Swedish freighter in a pitch-black night to fall far down into the unknown waters of a Russian harbor where they were moored. His instantly sobered companions had called a deckhand, and he had been got back aboard without much trouble. He enjoyed heroic status for the rest of the voyage. "You are insane, my dear Axel. You are quite insane," Bertie laughed as she spoke. She cut her own hair, and the thick crop shelf showed her thick neck. She spoke vigorously and laughed. Her eyes were blue and critical, taking inventory. When she laughed, she exposed large, strong teeth. When she walked, the floor shook. "You are such romantics," she said to me, meaning nothing admirable. Bertie had survived the Battle of Britain. Bertie hated the American soldiers who arrived in London saying, "Remember Pearl Harbor." They married the worst women imaginable. I must say we cheered them on. It looked for a time as if the Americans might be the solution to cleaning up Piccadilly. All the whores went to America as war brides. She smiled at me. I said yes and meant it. I meant to be a wife, however confused I might be by the terms. In my heart of hearts, I had made promises to the future. I would do my best not to blotch it. I meant to do it right. I meant all sorts of things Axel had no notion of. I would get on with this beastly woman I was now related to. I smiled at Bertie. It was very like smiling at a locomotive. Eleni Sikilianos.
Thank you. So good to hear Bobbie's work, and hopefully she'll get some of the due. She also merits. And is One Small Saga out of print still? Does anyone know? Anyway, if you haven't read it, read it. I'm going to read something that I wrote, and then I'm going to read something on behalf of Laird Hunt, who wasn't able to be here tonight. First, I was Bobbie's student, then I was Bobbie's colleague at Naropa, and I was also Bobbie's friend. When we honored her in Colorado, I'd thought of trying to read some of her vitamin-packed writing, her stories like smoked tumbleweed rolling just out of the fire. But her work is so full of her own specific and inimitable possibilities of voice, which we heard in person, sometimes sounding out of London, sometimes sounding out of deep Texas, that it's intimidating, nearly impossible to even imagine trying to inhabit those voices as anything other than listener, although we just heard Brenda do it beautifully. It's really something to have a voice like that demands, and I think that's the verb, demands a listener. Trying to pinpoint who Bobbie was, the trait, the essence, what I come to above all else is storyteller, and that is a very potent thing to be, a storyteller. She was also famously a talker. She talked about gardens and flowers because she was, besides a talker, a really good gardener. Why have I noted down the hero of her own journey? I guess because she was. For example, she wasn't afraid to rip everything out and start from scratch. There would be the murdered daylilies strewn across the walk, much to everyone's shock, and no one believed she could make a better garden than she already had, but then she did. When I moved to Boulder to teach, one of the first things she said to me is, "You're gonna want cleamies." I had to look up what those were. Phrases she was fond of, adjacent to, as in, get yourself adjacent to the most interesting person in the room because you're gonna learn things. Apropos, she was the first person probably I ever heard use that term, and she used it a lot, usually to keep everything turning and moving and flashing like a river cutting across the thickness of the earthbound. I run through many scenes in my head when I think about Bobbie. For example, turning her hearing aids down at faculty meetings that were boring or contentious, and then wondering what we had talked about. Another I have is, as a student, I started a union for ethnic inclusion, and we did these anti-racist trainings, and Bobbie came, and we were supposed to all stand in a circle and hold hands, and Bobbie said, "I am not standing in a circle and holding everybody's hand. I'm Indian." Anyway, but a simple story, is a memory of driving her to Denver. I was teaching Olson's Maximus poems, and I had the idea, somewhat stolen from Bobbie's admirer, Michael Ondaatje, to have Bobbie show her home movies of Olson at Gloucester and talk. It's funny because one of my vital memories of her counterweight, Bob, the Bob to the Bobbie, was driving him to Denver along the scenic route at his request, and which he could not see because the scenic part unfolded on the passenger side, which was his eyeless side, and he kept his good eye, a term I learned from Bobbie, in a story in which she punches him in it, mostly fixed on his interlocutors, me, driving, and Laird in the back seat. Anyway, I was driving Bobbie to Denver, not along the scenic route, but through rush hour traffic, and she was talking. I don't remember what she was saying, but it was a lot. At the delicate juncture between 36 and I-25, she must have sensed that traffic was making me tense because she said, "Do you want me to shut up?" And I said, "Maybe just for a minute." And she said, "Okay." And then she told me another story, not the one about punching Bob in his good eye while he was in the back seat and she was driving him, I think, to Scribner's, but maybe the one about Joe Brainerd on acid. When we got to class, the video wouldn't work. We ran to other rooms, found other machines, transferred things, finally got it to work. But she couldn't find Olson. Where was he? She speeded up past this or that person on her many hours of home films, saying things like, "Oh, there's Richard Brodigan and Bob in London. Now Brodigan." And then she ran things backwards, and there was John Cage running the wrong way in time. She narrated it all. I was panicking. We were never going to find the part that coincided with the reason these students were gathered. By now, we were well over an hour into this endeavor with no Olson. "Oh, there's Phil Whalen. He could be so annoying. And Bob, and there's Alan. This is Vancouver, the Poetry Festival. Oh, look." She slowed the film to regular speed. Now, this is just classic. I said, "Do something," because they were all just standing around and talking about poetry for hours. I said, "Do something." So Bob leaned down to tie his shoe. We watched this happen in the film. And immediately, Alan starts to take his clothes off. You could basically sum up their whole individual poetics in these two responses, Bobbie said. Bob bends down to tie his shoe, and Alan takes his clothes off. The students are mesmerized. No one cares about finding Olson. They found Bobbie and her stories. What does it mean to be a good storyteller? Because Bobbie wasn't just a storyteller, she was a good one. To the ancient Greeks, it meant you could weave the opening stuff of the world, which was chaos, into mythos, also known, Olson reminds us, by the term myth. It means you could create a fabric of existence and experience, and with it clothe the world. Give us shape and form. Give us sense. In other words, give us a reason for being alive. And then I'm going to read Laird Hunt's notes, who was also Bobbie's student and colleague and friend, and was also her assistant for a time. And right around when Bobbie died, he happened to find these journals from when he was first considering being Bobbie's student and then was her student. So there are a couple journal entries and then his notes. And actually Laird and Brenda were her students at the same time. So Bobbie-related entries. July 1991, Indiana. Read Bobbie Louise Hawkins' One Small Saga, a novella. I liked it. She said enough and used few words. The reader fills in the gaps if he wants. Grandma is in the other room reading it now and chuckling. It is easy to read. There are no complicated ideas. There are many important ones. It talks about a normal life. It talks about memory. It is about memory. It is written the way we remember things. It jerks and shudders and is mostly fluid. Bobbie Louise Hawkins might be my teacher. There is slow energy in this book. The characters come alive as memories. The woman is revealed slowly. We never see more than she sees. I thought her life was a little sad. It was a normal life. August 28th, Boulder, Naropa Writing and Poetics Orientation Session. Bobbie Louise Hawkins, her dark glasses, her legs in a loose dress, crossing in a rush, her irritation with the proceedings, and always, maybe? September 3rd, Boulder, still not exactly excited about the advent of classes, translation with Anselm Hollow and fiction workshop with B.L. Hawkins. Interested, though, and hoping to be enthusiastic when they actually start. September 4th, Boulder. First class with Bobbie Louise. Class met in the Bijou, a small theater, formerly a shed or garage. Room for 25 seats, skylights, lots of white and then pastels. Sat in the audience section, tables in a rectangular U around BL, who, much as if she were on the stage, took charge and seemed by her intensity, modulation of this, to be sucking a spotlight from the ceiling. 15 of us, and it was crowded, talked about POV and narrative. Class stayed relaxed so that I didn't get uptight about the terminology and the general mechanization of the process. Some interesting bits of lore and craft and shaping of ideas into neat little packets of words, the fictive act, quote, creating people into places. You're gonna have a non-story if nothing happens, Bobbie says. Happen can be subtle. A way to write a story is to write the happen part and then on to the end and back to the beginning. Interesting. September 12th, Boulder, Brillig Works Cafe. Spent the whole day with my head in a knot about a story, carried it over into class, which was a help. BL told me to just write the first bloody draft, then fix it. November 7th, Boulder. Bobbie Louise invited me and some other students over for a glass of wine and some talk. Apparently we are communicating. December 2nd, Boulder. Bobbie Louise paid me a grand compliment today. She called me a writer. And let's see, I'll read some of these other notes. In the workshop I took with Bobbie in the fall of 1991 in the Bijou Theater attached to her house, we found, explored, were given ways to bust out of ourselves, jailbreaks for the soul. One of her favorite images of the moment was when Buddy Bolden breaks formation and steps out of the parade he is playing in Michael Ondaatje's Coming Through Slaughter. Voice was key in our conversations, but not the old thing, old even then, about finding your voice, which notion was mocked. It was more like seeing if you had a self, and if the results came back positive in what key your voice might best sing it. Sharing a condition, a formulation Bobbie liked to deploy quite a bit, was at the core of what we were up to in the workshop. This was connected to, but not limited by, the concept of community building. Sharing a condition was more intimate, more intense, more game-changing at the level of one's artistic DNA than community building. Bobbie liked the word interesting. Not so much as it applied to things, ideas, but as it applied to people. She's interesting, Bobbie might say. If you were interesting, you might get asked with a few of your fellows to stay after class for a glass of wine. Writers Bobbie brought into the class I took with her included Ondaatje, Lucia Berlin, Colette, Brodigan, Fielding Dawson, Henry Green, and Marguerite Duras. She mentioned Duncan, Dahlberg, Olson, and Creeley a great deal during class, and we got the idea that poetry must and did absolutely people the house of prose. Proper microphone technique was the subject of an entire session. Popping of peas was to be avoided, and the right time to turn a most definitely non-stapled page was emphasized, and the notion of cutting the mic was discussed. Bobbie had her own rather slow photocopier at the Bijou, and there was always a great deal of last-minute photocopying and handing out of photocopied pages of books she was reading. She handled, with only a slight furrowing of her brow, my young man's mention in a story of an unbelievably ancient woman who was 61, exactly Bobbie's age at the moment, and suggested just a touch dryly that I might make the age of the ancient one indeterminate. The seriousness of the endeavor of writing, of the life, the long haul, was stressed over and over again. It was important to be serious. Serious, which didn't mean humorless, was something one could strive for. Interesting people were serious, but being serious didn't mean you were interesting, and she didn't mind letting you know the jury was still out on your particular case. Them's the breaks. At least it was something. Oh, honey, she might say. Okay, and next we have Iris Cushing.
Such an honor to be here and honor Bobbie with you all. So I met Bobbie in the fall of 2015 through the Lost and Found Poetics Document Initiative and Amiel Alcalay, who introduced me to her work. And I edited a chapbook of 2 of her lectures that she gave at Naropa in 1989 and 2005, and traveled out to Boulder and spent Halloween weekend with her that fall. And it was at a time in my life where I was really grappling with and figuring out how I thought of myself as a writer and as a woman, and what I wanted people to think of me and how I wanted to be perceived and what I wanted my persona to be. And by the time I came away from spending that time with Bobbie Louise, I was convinced that I could and should just totally not give a fuck about what anybody else thought, and actually just be myself and be authentic, and then that would be the most powerful position to take. And she was I was amazed with the incredible wit and humor with which she communicated that message. One of the first things she told me in our conversations was that she believed that humor was one of the most vital aspects of active intelligence, and that was one of the kind of things that she looked for right away. So I'm going to share some excerpts from our interview that we did together, which spanned the course of a couple of days, and then also some excerpts from the lectures that she gave on the voice, on the sounding word, as she termed it, and on Colette. So this is from our interview that we did in October of 2015. It seems to me, this is what Bobbie said to me. It seems to me one of the big things that has to happen with someone going into the public domain, which is what you do to some extent when you write, you don't really write for people. That's what people think. People think writers write for them. Ha! And the fact is, we write for us. And we're people. So it stands to reason that there are going to be some of them, like us, that want to see what we're working on. One of the things I've been registering, well, lately I've been doing a little bit of writing about this place. And she alluded to the atrium. That was the assisted living place where she was living in Boulder. I've been doing a little bit of writing about this place, which is filled with mostly old ladies and a few old men. And this one woman, for instance, who's about 95, said to me, "Well, my son's gone." And I said, "Did you have a good time?" And she said, "With him?" And I was thinking, there's no way you can get what's funny about that on paper, because what it is that it requires is the voice, the voicing. The voicing has always been really, I think most writers are absolutely addicted to voicing. When I was teaching writing at Naropa, the students who would have the most difficulty were the ones who would get glamorized by texts that used a vocabulary that wasn't theirs. And then you would suddenly find them using words like perused. I hate perused. I think, where did that word come from? I mean, that's a weird word. Most people who want to be artists, as soon as they start, it's as if there's themselves, and then there is this larger scale, and that larger scale is themselves, the artist. And so when they start being the artist, they'll do things like, they'll want to use words that writers who they have adored use. And they'll start writing stuff that's really crap. And it's really like one of the toughest things about young writers is getting them to actually give it up and go along with it, that they're probably good enough. Just good enough. They're already good enough. In fact, they're as good as they're going to be until they get better. But right now, however you are, and I just adore writers that go with the speaking voice on the page. When I decided to go into writing seriously, for me, that really meant I had to be as bad as I had to be until I got good, When I meant to do it seriously, I registered that I was an inexperienced writer, but I was a very experienced talker. So I thought, okay, if I can talk it onto the paper, I'll probably save myself miles of bad writing. And so that's what I focused on. I focused on speaking onto the paper. If you're a writer, you're probably a reader. And in the course of being a reader, there are these rhythms that somehow attach to your person. And those rhythms are like putting on comfortable clothes. So you start out writing something and you suddenly fall into, actually it's something you want to watch out for because that rhythm can be wrong for something you want to say sometimes. But more often it's the rhythm of you declaring something, of you making a statement, whether it's a storytelling or whatever. That seems to me is about as close to the truth as you can get as a writer. Because once you're in your own rhythms, I think that's one of the reasons I really loved Colette. Okay, this is from her lecture that she gave at Naropa in 1989 titled The Sounding Word. My topic is the speaking voice and where it takes us. The resonating, sounding voice that takes our body as its instrument, turns the lungs into bellows, turns the diaphragm into a pressure gauge, and sends air through the sounding, shaping environment of our throat and tongues and lips to be words. And around those words, through them, celestial symphonies of nuance, tone, and timbre, tessitura, and intent. Did I lose anybody on timbre and tessitura? Timbre is something that stays the same in an individual person, whether you're talking, singing, crying, or yelling. You're the only one who's got it. If two people said the same word at the same time, in the same pitch, at the same volume, their voices would still sound different. And that's timbre. Tessitura is within the range you're capable of making a voice sound at. There's an area wherein your ideal voice functions. That's your tessitura. Whether in speech or whether in song, when a person is performing, they ideally locate their voice at the opening of a performance in the middle range, the middle of the middle. That is the middle of the tessitura, which gives them the ups and downs for emphasis. If you inadvertently get yourself stuck at the up or the bottom of your tessitura, you've only got one way to move for emphasis. Around those words, through them, celestial symphonies of nuance, tone, and timbre, tessitura, and intent. And intent is the thrust of thought. And the infinity of that word's history that has saturated it with meaning and made it a telling word, afloat in the air of this ephemeral moment. Hearing it proves it is gone, that quick. Valerie says, I distrust all words. I've reached that point, alas, of comparing those words on which we so lightly traverse the space of a thought to light planks thrown across an abyss which permit crossing but no stopping. A man in quick motion can use them and get away, but if he hesitates the least bit in the world, this fraction of time breaks them down and altogether fall into the depths. He who hurries has caught on. He must not dwell heavily. He would soon find the clearest speech to be a tissue of obscure terms. I found myself when we were talking often going, geez, Louise. And then I would go, geez, Bobbie Louise. All right, this is from her, just a bit from her lecture on Colette, which I felt like was kind of jarringly, when I reread this the other day, was kind of jarringly pertinent to our time that we're in right now. Colette wrote, then saw her writing be taken objectively, be edited into acceptability, and she was given, however unwillingly, the education none of us will ever have. She had the discipline imposed on her that most writers lack. Perhaps to have a life means we must choose our tyranny. If our tyrants come ready-made, they seldom come with us in mind. It's themselves they mean. So if you can create your own tyranny, you're in a lot better place. What's interesting then is how the person being made use of continues to have being. It's more than use, and continues becoming that person they meant, even when obscured by the intentions of others. And then another piece from that lecture, she said, the question of knowing something and the diction as a writer that you then use to express it is a huge issue for writers. It's as if your entire diction is finally a word that doesn't exist except for you having this word. And this word is everything that you think of in a totality. And you bring that word to bear. And when you do, anyone who hears the aspects of it that are kindred to themselves, it's free for them to take. The main reason we have to read a lot is in order to enhance our own diction. When you read a person expressing an attitude which you know you feel but have never said, and now you have heard it said, it is reinforced in you that you now not only feel it, but know it, and know it in words. Thank you, Bobbie Louise. And next is Barbara Henning.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to read first something from the selected prose from the beginning, the preface that I helped Bobbie get published, and then I'm going to read one of her short stories, very short, and then I'll read something from Louis Warsh. When I was at Naropa University for the summer program in June 2011, Bobbie came to my prose chat, and we planned to get together later in the week. Meanwhile, in the Poetics Library, I picked up a copy of her novel, One Small Saga, and read it that same night. It is beautifully written prose with poetic disjunction and rhythm, the story of a young artist on a journey to Belize with her new husband. I wanted to interview Bobbie about the book. Unfortunately, she became ill, and I wasn't able to see her that week. So we conducted our interview over the telephone. One phone call led to another, one book to another. So we started having interviews about everything she had ever written, and it was so fascinating. It turned into a very long interview, a book of poems by Belladonna, and this book of selected prose. So as you already know why, okay? I remember Bobbie saying something like, "What do you mean, fiction? This is about my life." She went on, "Robert Duncan once said there is no such thing as fiction." And that makes more sense than almost anything. And when at one point I started looking back through my stories, I thought, I've almost never written a fictional line in my life. Your mind gets on something and you just meander along with it. I don't think that's fiction, it's all autobiography. The stories in Back to Texas are about her mother, their relatives, about growing up in Texas. In The Sanguine Breast of Margaret, she retells in a fictional framework the story of she and Bob Creeley's traveling to Guatemala with their 4 children in 1959. And that's also in this book. It had only been published before in England. With a lot of work when you were on the road in a broken down van. Oh, wait a minute. But wow, what a lot of work when you're on the road in a broken down van with 4 small children and not enough money to get where you're going, washing diapers in roadside bathrooms, and yet a moment of danger becomes a moment of beauty. Exhausted, the main character, Margaret, is driving through Mexico while Patrick sleeps. Quote, "Driving in the darkest small hours in the morning, oncoming headlights would splay out across the wet windshield like exploding stars." Once Bobbie said to me, "I mean, my relatives, dear, were incredible. And it was all because of that habit of sitting around a big kitchen table with a coal oil lamp and telling stories, just passing around the table from one person to the next. That was a major entertainment. Everyone would laugh, even if it was the 50th time they heard the story, because it was like a performance. So as a child, I had that background. While interviewing Bobbie and transcribing, it sometimes seemed as if I was orchestrating a series of new narratives. Walter Benjamin writes, "Every morning brings us the news of the globe, and yet we are poor in noteworthy stories. We don't have to be so poor with a storyteller like Bobbie. By including this interview with these already acclaimed stories, we are bringing into print new noteworthy stories, stories she had entertained her friends and students with over and over again. It is my pleasure to have been part of this process." I was just helping her kind of find a contact to do this. And then the contacts were kind of difficult. And so I thought, well, I'll just help her. And pretty soon I was doing the whole thing. She said, "You should just make yourself the editor of this book." I said, "Okay, well, all right, I'll do that." Okay. It was a long process. It was fun. I'm going to read one story called Bathroom Animal Castration Story. This is a bathroom animal castration story. Diana and Drummond Hadley have a wild cat that was given to them by the guy that runs the Desert Museum in Tucson. It stands maybe 2 feet high and is really substantial if you're used to looking at house cats. It plays. If you pull a wad of paper on a string, it plays. A little languidly, but it's playing. And the wildcat, as it plays, keeps its claws sheathed. And you get a little breathless from not really breathing normally. And you get exhilarated with relief because every time the wildcat could jump you, he doesn't. He just keeps batting the paper wads almost politely with his paws like mittens. But when you look into his eyes, you don't get further than the surface. He looks at you totally blank, no recognition of you, your organism, your species, nothing. When you look that creature in the eyes, it's like there's no earthly reason for the two of you to be in the same room. It feels like you've taken off your shoes and socks and gone for a walk on a glacier. When I went to the bathroom, I realized the wildcat was as fast as it was supposed to be. I opened the door and the wildcat rushed to the toilet bowl before me. Well, okay. I decided between two evils. I decided not to put the creature out. It was a lazy choice. The cover was closed, and as I reached to open it, I saw that the wildcat was getting compulsive. It was pacing and jumping and generally acting nutty with all its attention focused on the toilet bowl. It was waiting for me to open the lid for some reason of its own. I realized that there was going to be a skirmish with a winner and a loser. I knew which one I wanted to be. I stood between the wildcat and the toilet seat. I blocked its every move while I did the necessary clothing stuff. I reached back of me and raised the lid, keeping my eyes on the wildcat all the time. He went frantic. He rushed back and forth in front of me, trying to get past me, trying to look through me. I won. After I was seated, he went really cool and uninterested. Who needs it? I stood up, flushed the toilet, and wasn't vigilant. It seemed like there was no need to be. The wildcat hit the toilet. He pounced his two front paws into the bowl after the disappearing water. Water flew to the ceiling. He pounced over and over. Water was spewing up into the walls, the ceiling. I got soaked getting the lid closed. He dug the game was over. We walked out of the bathroom together. Why does your wildcat jump at the water? I asked Diana. Oh, yes, she said, laughing. Men get really nervous. Okay. Now, Louise asked me to read this. Hold on. Take a little drink here. Allergy season. Louis Warsh can't be here tonight because of health reasons, and he asked me to read what he had prepared to say. I first met Bobbie Louise Hawkins in the summer of 1970 when she and her family moved to Bolinas, California, the small coastal town an hour north of San Francisco where I was living. We were friends and neighbors until 1973 when I moved back east. In spring 1971, I was organizing a reading series at the Intersection Church in San Francisco, and I asked Bobbie to read with Joanne Kiger. At the same time, Joe Brainerd was visiting Bolinas from New York, and I somehow convinced him to introduce Bobbie and Joanne at their reading. His introductions are miraculously included in his collected writings, which were published by the Library of America in 2012. So here is Joe introducing Bobbie at her Intersection reading in the summer of 1971. Bobbie Creeley. When Bobbie was a kid, she wanted to be Shirley Temple. Between then and now, Bobbie has been a car hop, a door-to-door magazine salesman, an usherette, a disc jockey, worked in an advertising agency, made Indian jewelry with the Indians for tourists to watch, an actress, and at 13 was a Baptist preacher. What Bobbie is a poet, a painter, a novelist, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, can really whistle good, sings too, intelligent, from Texas, a really great talker, and easy to cry. That Bobbie has done a lot is still not as interesting as what will happen next, and that's exciting. I think it's safe to say that Bobbie is not satisfied, and that's a compliment. That was Joe Brainerd. Bobbie and I were in touch intermittently for many years after I left California, but once she moved to Boulder, Colorado to teach at Naropa, we saw each other whenever I was invited to teach in the summer writing program. In 2007, I asked her whether she was interested in publishing a book of her writing with United Artists Books. She was ambivalent at first, but eventually, and with the encouragement of Ann Waldman, she sent me a manuscript of stories and personal essays, and we worked on the book, which became Absolutely Eden, published in 2008. Bobbie was a great conversationalist, and she used conversation as a form of investigation, a way of imparting information and seeking out contrary opinions. She was a listener, a storyteller, all-inclusive in her sense of what was possible to say or not, and especially adept at bringing out introverted types, Joe Brainerd and myself among them. It's hard to read her stories on the page without hearing her voice and the emphatic way she made everything come out sounding right, as if she actually meant what she was saying. Soulful is a word that comes to mind about her nature in general, and I must say my life has been different in the best way as a result of knowing her. I saw her last in July 2016 at her apartment in Boulder. She showed me her new collages, and we talked about all the people we knew in common, and I went away thinking how much time had gone by, and here was that same voice, intrepid, conveying everything, the same heart-stopping music I remembered from long ago. That was Louise. Next is Julie Patton.
Narrow diapers, intrepid, these people, these people, those people, be late, overpopulated people, lumping, die, electrically opposed people. This sin, this, that, those, and these people, this, able, this, please, people, as you people, who you people agree to disagree by decreasing disparate, disparate lot, this posing at the plot, so depose despots who have a lot of have-nots, dispensing the spoils, dispensing these performing Bobbie hated peas. I had an unlikely alliance with Bobbie. It was related to Mormonism. Anybody here remember anything about Bobbie and the Mormon church? No? Anyway, apart from teaching in the fall semester at Naropa in 1994, I think I was living in Venice when I got a call from Anne that a certain individual who was kind of like my boss at Teachers and Writers, Ron Jett, had suggested me to come to Naropa. So I did. And there I met a young Mormon couple. They were the coolest couple. They had an amazing souped-up car and the baddest haircuts, and they were Mormons. Matt Corey, and published my first book, Rodent Yes. And I can't remember his wife's name. He had kids already. They lived in China as missionaries. Band. And I think on Sunday mornings, I remember first going with them to Bobbie's house because I think they took Bobbie's mom to church every Sunday. So my association with Bobbie was around tea time, drinking, talking about plants, and the same. She told me about the same plant. That was the first time I heard about it. So we shared we had Texas in common because I had lived there briefly, and high cheekbones, and Mormonism, and some Native American roots. Anyway, it was her dislike of peas. I don't remember that piece, but I remember, this is what I remember in my ears, and it was about a response to her saying, I just can't stand. Because I had done a reading. It was my first reading, because I'm still perpetrating poetry even now. And we also had a relationship to making visual work, and that was the doorway through which I was climbing through into the world of sound and shaping words. And so I remember doing a reading, and that's when she said, honey, if you could just do something about those peas. So that inspired the piece, which I don't really remember because I never finished it, but anyway. Thank you, and thank you, Bobbie, and Europa, and the family of artists gathered here in this room. Penn Creeley, with a contribution from Sarah Hall Creeley. Thanks.
So now for something completely different. I'm here. Can you hear me? Thank you. Wow, that high. I don't know. Thank you. So Sarah asked me to read the eulogy that she wrote for her mother, Bobbie. Sarah is... so the things I'm going to say tonight are about our family. I am honored to be a part of that family. I also honor Bobbie as a writer, a woman who lived through extraordinary struggles and came out on the other side not only as a very clearly vibrant and wonderful writer, which I can't speak to, but as a vibrant, full-hearted person who spoke her mind, but in the end, always consolidated with us as a family. Sarah generously refers to me as her other mother. I have known her since she was 18. Clearly we've all been through a great deal together. Sarah said, you know, Penn, go for the laugh line. The initials of other mother are O-M, which is Ohm, and that for me recalls Allen Ginsberg, who was so important to both my parents. So here I am, that person. I also would like to recognize that Sarah's sister Hannah is here tonight. Her brother Will would be here, but Will is off in Alabama doing his best to defend our freedom of speech, which, go Will. We all need it. We all rely on it. I also would like to pass on the very sad news that Kirsten, Bobbie's firstborn, died last week. It's a heartbreaking loss for Sarah, who was very close to Kirsten for many years. I would like us, while we remember and recognize Bobbie, to hold Kirsten in the light as well. There's a wonderful story that Robert told me about Kirsten. She shared her mother's extraordinary creativity. In the late 60s, I expect, they were living in Gloucester. Kirsten strung together marvelous beads, which she took into Harvard Square to sell. They sold out quickly to a group of people who she later found was in fact the Grateful Dead. I love that story. So now I would like you to imagine that I am Sarah, that I speak with a wonderful enthusiasm and a great smile, a lovely movement of her body, and her mother's vivacity. Sarah says, "Thank you so much for being here to celebrate my truly amazing mother, Bobbie Louise Hawkins. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you all today. I wrote an essay about what I learned from Mum. I was so lucky to be her daughter." And she says, "I'm lucky to have a second mother, Pen Creeley, who has said yes to reading this for me. Bobbie Louise Hawkins was my mother. Mum was 100% genuine, no bullshit. She taught me to question authority and to be myself. Most of the things Mum taught me were by example in the way she lived her life. I feel grateful that she was so comfortable with her beauty and with being herself. Mum wasn't afraid, and her comfort level in her own unique self gave me the freedom to be myself and not to worry about what others think." I think we've all heard that tonight very powerfully. "When I was a child, my parents and their friends looked very different from most people who lived in our communities of Placitas, New Mexico, Buffalo, New York, and the small farming town of Eden in upstate New York. As different as Mum was, with her mini dresses and long hair, I never felt embarrassed by her. I was proud of her differences and her rejection of being like everybody else. In suburban Buffalo, when I was in the 4th grade, I remember our family getting pulled over repeatedly by the Buffalo police, who would search our car, always finding nothing. What seemed to set them off was the length of my dad's hair that touched his collar and his goatee beard. Mum and Dad never showed fear or became upset when this happened, so I never made much of it. When we were living in the dairy farm country of upstate New York, in the tiny town of Eden, the other parents seemed shocked at back-to-school night by my two hip parents with long hair and jeans. Mum had a great sense of style throughout her life that I just loved. Mum was so strong, steely strong, and I try to be like that too. Motherhood for Mum was heartbreaking. When I was 2, my older sister, Leslie, was killed when she was 8, and my earliest memory is my mum crying in the kitchen. My sisters, Kirsten and Leslie, were playing in a small underground tunnel, and it caved in, and they couldn't get Leslie out in time. Many years later, my two sisters, Kate and Kirsten, became schizophrenic within a short time of each other, and to me it felt like the death of the persons they were. Mom and Dad did everything they could to help my sisters after they became sick. Kate was 14 and Kirsten was 20. Mom was profoundly affected by all this, as were we all. Mom was a fierce fighter for people she loved and wanted to help. Her mom, Nora Hall, was like that, and I'm like that, and my daughter Miranda is fierce too. When my two sisters became schizophrenic in Bolinas, California, Mom worked hard to help them in any way she could. She bought what today would be called a tiny home for my older sister, Kirsten, so she could live on Mom's property. Later, when Mom moved to Boulder, she moved Kate to Boulder too, and found a caring group home setting for Kate to live in. Before Mom got sick, she and Kate used to go to the movies once a week together. When I came to visit from California, Mom, Kate, and I would all go to the movies. Mom worked hard caring for her mom. When she was in her 80s, she bought her a home in Boulder, a few blocks away from where she lived, so she could be with her. I always felt loved by my mom, and her love and loyalty towards me taught me to be the same with my adult children, Miranda and Devin. Mom was a problem solver who was always looking for solutions. She taught me that. I don't want to listen to somebody complain who's unwilling to try to fix whatever's wrong. What can I do? How can I help change things for the better? I will just add here that Sarah has spent her life as a second grade teacher. She's wonderfully committed to her pupils and looks forward eagerly to each new year as they come along. By this stage, she's taught several generations of the same families in Hercules, California, just outside of San Francisco. And she equally is sad when the class moves on to be in the third grade. And she certainly has helped a great deal of people. She's also very politically involved and fights quite hard for her schools and her community. Mom encouraged me to question authority, which I did when my younger sister Kate was 14 and hospitalized at Langley Porter in San Francisco. Kate was over-medicated with 800 milligrams of Thorazine a day. I felt like the drugs turned her into a zombie who could still walk, but she was very out of it. I challenged Kate's doctor when we were at a family therapy group, and my parents didn't shut me down. I was 16 at the time. Many years later, Mom told how the doctor had made a comment about me being over-defensive because I was the middle sister of two sisters, both of whom had schizophrenia, implying I was really just scared about myself. His comment went over my head, but Mom understood it. She was proud of me for standing She was proud of me for standing up to him. Mom had so much character, she could see the doctor was being a bully. Mom was independent, and she was happy living alone. Our culture builds up a couple mentality, and for a long time I felt I needed someone else to be happy. When I was in an unhappy relationship, Mom told me, there are worse things than being alone. So true. Mom taught me through her life that a single person can be happy and live a full life. Watching her follow her creative passions, writing, art, and teaching was inspiring. Even though she was happy living on her own in Boulder, Mum asked me several times on different visits if I thought she should have stayed with my dad, who was Robert Creeley. I'm sure I rolled my eyes and said each time, "No, Mom," because they were both so unhappy together. Mum and Dad had a strong love and mutual respect for each other that lasted their entire lives. They both had a passion for language and writing that made a powerful connection between them. When they were together, they wanted different things from each other that each ultimately was not willing to give. Dad wanted Mum to take care of the house and simply be there for him, and Mum wanted Dad's encouragement and support as she grew creatively. Thankfully, they parted and both went on to live happier lives. Mum and Dad continued as friends and family, with Dad often participating in Naropa's summer program. Mum asking me this question showed me that Dad was still very much in her heart. When I visited Mum in Boulder, we often watched TV together, and she introduced me to Fawlty Towers, Rumble in the Bronx with Jackie Chan, Third Rock from the Sun, Mad About You, and Monk. I grew to love these shows because of her. Mum also introduced me to MSNBC, a channel she loved to watch, and one I watch now, although not as much as she did. Something I really loved about Mum was her great sense of humor. She was able to tell stories that would make you laugh, even though the situation was challenging. My mum taught me the value of good stories, reading every day, something I loved doing. Mum was my favorite writer, and I love her stories. Mum's resilience and humor is inspiring to me. She told me about taking my grandmother to a doctor's appointment to see why she was being so forgetful. Mum and grandmother were in the doctor's office as he popped in and said, "Ms. Hall, the results are back. You've got Alzheimer's." Mum said he then quickly turned around and left the room. Grandmother looked at Mum and said, "I used to know what that was, but I forgot." Grandmother smiled and they left. I love this story. It's sad, but it's funny. Mum's determination to live was amazing. She and I watched Harold and Maude together when she was in her 60s, and she told me that she wanted to be like Maude. Maude did herself in at 80 years old. In her life, Mum became the opposite of Maude, almost making it to 88, living through multiple viruses, pneumonia, and living with COPD. Mum had grown used to getting really sick and then getting better. At 87 years old, she survived metapneumovirus, something that everyone around her in the hospital was wearing gloves and masks to prevent because it was known for killing children. Near the end of Mum's life, she fell, causing a break in one of her femurs. Mum walked on that broken bone for a week. That's how steely strong and thoroughly tough my mother was. Sadly, that break soon caused the end of my mother's life. Mum taught me that a person can keep creating and growing for as long as she lives. Mum taught me that I could love someone, her and others, with all of my heart, the way she loved me. Thank you. And the next reader is Eileen Miles. I never thought I'd get to introduce you.
Hi, this has been amazing, and it's so great to follow Penn. I have a story. I have a Bobbie story, and then a story to read. Though I have such a memory, which wasn't what I was planning to think of. I think when Laura asked us for quotes for the piece she wrote, I thought about when Bobbie came and taught a workshop here in 77, and I think I was in my 20s, and I had just come out, and I was all about being really tough. And it just was like, and I would go to any workshop that they had here, but not necessarily like the person teaching it. And there was this kind of woman with this like big spirit, and she was on tour with 2 other women. And this actually, it's not a story at all. It's just completely visual, because she was sitting at the head of the table, and I was just angry at the other end of the table with a big cigar. Like I just wanted her attention so bad, and I had such a feeling of a fuck you, because that's just how I felt at that moment in time. And I remember she was just so graceful, and so she just kind of had this way where, like, I was both there and not there, and there was no way to keep my anger going, because she was so sort of relaxed and so beautiful about her own existence. She just knocked my anger down in this very funny, sweet way. There wasn't anything to be up against, which was just kind of awesome. But the story I wanted to tell is one of the things I loved about the story she told was that she would tell the story and then she would smile, and that was really the last line, where it was just like there was an element of triumph. And this was like a Bob and Lucia story, and I think it went back to New Mexico when the story I'm going to tell. So, and I guess maybe Bob and Bobbie had gone out, and Lucia babysat for them. And so, and I think Lucia was in her aspiring writer mode and writing, and she had given Bob some work. And so he was driving her home after she babysat, and on the way home, he pulled over under this tree, and she thought, no, he's going to talk to me about my work. And they sat there for a moment in the moonlight looking at the tree, and he said, Lucia, see that cottonwood tree? And she was like, yeah, Bob. And he said, be like that tree for your man. It's just, and then she smiled when she told the story. It was just like shit talking about somebody you loved forever, My story. And this is from her. This is my first Kindle. I didn't have this book, but I wanted to read from it. So this is from her selected, and it's amazing. It's so hard. I didn't practice out loud, but I looked at the story a lot, because it's so hard to read a story by somebody who's channeling somebody else's story. You're just going through 2 voices at once, and the timing is so like musical. One of the best times. We should be at Klein's Corners in about 10 minutes. I believe it's right over that hill yonder, babe. You just go straight ahead on the ridge and then circle back. Mama went on with her story. One of the best times that I remember when we were kids was when we lived out there south of Abilene on a farm. We had a big old 2-story farmhouse with a great big earth tank down at the back. There was a spring above that fed into it. This big old tank had a gravel bottom and fresh water run into it all the time out of this spring. Then on the far side, there was a place that had run out. That earth tank was us kids' joy and pleasure. We'd swim in it all summer, and then we'd skate on it all winter. And we'd go down there and build us a big fire on the bank. We'd go out on that ice and skate and slide until we was tired and cold. Then we'd go get warm at the fire. We used to take eggs down there to boil in a bucket or some kind of meat to cook on a stick over the fire. In the fall, after the feed had been gathered and brought in, our stepdaddy would take these great big field rakes. It's like a plow. You pull it with horses. And he'd start at one end of that field, and he'd rake all the stalks to the center of the field. There'd be a pile of stalks 4 or 5 feet high and real wide, 5 or 6 feet, and it would go all the length of the field, which was, heavenly days, a good mile long. We'd wait until some night when the wind was in the right direction, and we'd get the neighbors' kids that was our ages to come over. It was when the wind would be blowing from one end of that pile to the other end, that direction. We'd start burning that pile at one end, and we'd stay down there until it had burned across the whole length of the field, which normally took until the wee small hours of the morning. We'd play games around the fire, and we'd take food down there to cook. We really had a fine time when we were little ones and had a chance to have it. Her voice was wistful. What made all that change? They had an influx of grasshoppers. It was 4 or 5 years in a row that the grasshoppers ate everything. They ate the feed. They ate the cotton. You know, as the little cotton came out of the ground, they'd just bite it right down at the ground. This happened for 3 or 4 years. It wasn't just us, it was everybody in this whole area. At the time it started, we had 14 nice milk cows, plus all the calves that we had for beef, and young bulls. And we had chicken and pigs, the things you keep to kill off. The first 2 or 3 years, well, the first year we did all right on the proceeds of former crops. Then the next year, my stepdaddy had to borrow some money from the bank to make a crop. All right, they got wiped out by the grasshoppers again that year. Everybody did. Then the next year, everybody borrowed toward a crop. Everybody was in the same position that third year because the bankers in self-defense had to lend the money for crops because it was their only hope of getting their money back. Then when it happened again the next year, well, the farmers either had to turn over everything they had to the bank, their farming tools and cattle and all, or they had to sell it all for next to nothing. Whatever they had, the banks took. It was bad all the way around. So at that time, everybody moved to towns to try and get work because there wasn't any work on the farms. Would that have been around the time that Peter was 9? Was that why he had to go off and saw wood? No, he didn't have to. He did that because my stepdaddy was so mean to him that he just couldn't stand it any longer. He just got up and left. But my stepdaddy did have a nice son. That was our stepbrother. That's where Peter went. What was he doing? Yes, come to think of it, that was during the same time. What the stepbrother was doing, he went way back into the wooded country and he cut wood for people that had wood stoves, which was most people. When they would haul it to whoever wanted it, or they'd take it to the wood yard in the town. Look, there's snow on the mountains over Santa Fe. First snow of the season. If I remember it right, we got it even earlier last year. So then you moved to town? My stepdaddy got some kind of job. I don't remember what. Oh, one thing, he was one of these, what they used to call faith doctors. He was? Yeah, he, cool little babe. You'll be right there in a minute, top of the bridge. Now it's the next one. Yeah, he did a lot of people a lot of good. For instance, there was this one man that come to him that had his toes curled under just like this. She held her hand out with the fingers under to show me. Oh, honey, you can just go straight ahead and then take a left, she interrupted herself. I should go right, shouldn't I? You can go either one, but if you go left, we come out at Klein's Corners and get us a Coke. Okay. It's easier than making that big swirl. This man's toes have been that way for years. My stepdaddy worked with those some way and talked to that man, and when he got through, this man had told him he'd give him any amount of money if he got those toes straightened out. He got those toes straightened out, and the man gave him $10 or $15. Ann Waldman.
This is so wonderful. So great to see everybody. So wonderful to have Penelope here and Hannah. It means a lot. So, a couple of things. This is from Frenchie and Cuban Pete. Why does anyone write except to speak of those things that conversation will never elicit? What is closest to the heart? And to speak of the personal with some accuracy in the proper setting, and to have finally and for once the statement of the thing, dear thing, caught out of the void, caught onto paper, to be there at last as real as what usually happens, namely that we are so often misshapen by event, obscured by misunderstanding. I know how those papers flutter in every breeze, ephemeral. They are so fragile. Statement is fragile. It only exists as its record. But the records of the heart return to the heart as information, and we are so hungry for it. Why does anyone write except to say what presses closest to them, what matters? There's an old Texas saying that I think I may be the only one who remembers it. It goes, I've enjoyed just about as much of this as I can stand. It's a magic formula that lets you head for the door past all the frenzy of any minute. Now it's going to get significant. It's a way to say that whatever you had in mind, this ain't it. It lets you stop eating slop that needs a palate and a vocabulary.
I've enjoyed just about as much of this as I can stand. Okay, and this, just a little brief memoir, and it's kind of a footnote. Laura, who's written a wonderful piece on Bobbie Hendrickson, who spoke earlier, asked for some comment. I think, Eileen, that's where you also... So I wanted to add this at the end. So, okay, Bobbie. Late 1960s, I remember how stunning Bobbie was. The first time the angles of her face, the Cherokee bones people were saying of her face. She was friendly, self-assured, open to people, panoramically aware, attentive, and always seemed on. And there was her voice and Texas, honey, which she carried, and it glowed, down-home witty. But she had also been in exotic places, London, British Honduras, Tokyo, and her body moved with assurance, grace, also rooted in how smart, how conscious she was. And she did not suffer fools. What a relief. There was a bunch of women who were just under a generation ahead who did not suffer fools. Diane DePrima, Joanne Kiger, and Bobbie's speech had an elegant rhetorical wit. Bobbie had great memory for the luminous particulars of how things were said, the oracular, the inane, the intimate, philosophical. She was an antennae, like we're supposed to be antennae of the race. She had a strong handshake, a muscular embrace, gustatory. Can an embrace be gustatory and eager for the high talk? She was instantly right there on your radar. I would gaze at her moving around a room, seeing her from a distance with Bob. They were a galvanizing, heady couple. For Love, Bob's book from 1962, gathering up also older poems dedicated to her. One had a romance with her through his poems. It was never just Bob in those days. It was Bob and Bobbie, so they were mythic, and then she would be the mythic Bobbie all on her own until it wasn't mythic anymore. Oh, well, I will say here, knowing each man, let you find a good wife too and love her as hard as you can. The warning for love, I would split open your head and put a candle in behind the eyes. Love is dead in us if we forget the virtues of an amulet and quick surprise. Why couldn't Bobbie be the amulet, her gift a quick surprise? More public occasions, mostly in public in New York, Chinatown with Alan, Bill Katz, Ellie Dorfman, nights at Max's, Kansas City. Joe Brainerd adored her, something in Boston. Come muse, memory, help me here, but the point is, were we so many on these intersecting trajectories here to what? Make it what? The Poetry Project, which had begun in 66. There was her show at the Gotham. Book Mart, Poets Hub, 74, the year we founded Naropa in Boulder, and I had been thinking of her primarily as a visual artist. There were her illustrations for Black Sparrow Press, the cover for Mother magazine. My favorite portraits she did, transforming photos, have a great presence sitting as I write this. She did everything with that uplifted flair. But visiting her in Bellina's 70s, and I had seen for myself she was a writer, had that inkling of her as writer. Bobbie had thought of herself as an artist from age 15. Then I sensed the dilemma of her trying to be a writer and knew from then on her struggle and saw it firsthand. The fights over, the man banging at the woman's door, her designated studio, she inside trying to write, the male's stubborn adherence to some sense of norm. I can never live in a house with a woman who writes. She had to hide the writing in a box. I remember thinking how odd this was in 1970, bohemian, temporary, autonomous zones. Like it wasn't enough room for two high wire acts. This was painful from some bits. Sweet dreamland faces passing to and fro bring back to memory days of long ago. Ted Berrigram. Joanne's rage as wide as spread out on a table, and herself with a first-rate boarding house reach. Gray eyes, her gray eyes. She shrugged her shoulder and abandoned the personal side of the subject. Actually, we cannot put ourselves back into the spirit of those days. A punitive spirit entered into our subsequent negotiations. Soft and slow cartwheel of yourself, sheathe your tongue, walk in the hot sunshine. You're so human. You know what I mean. You always put your hand out to see if it's raining. Boulder. So I visited with Bob soon after we founded the school, and JKS got created. Mustered, and then it seemed natural when things were falling apart to get her back here. We needed prose. I knew her talent. There were the books coming, buzz about the writing, her reading. She was thinking writerly. She had her whole life to draw, and it was always autobiographical, she always said. And suddenly, bags unpacked, a house on Bluff Street, and she loved all the details of putting that home together. Mail order catalogs, the wicker furniture. A lot of emphasis was on the garden, the outside, the garage, which became the Bijou Theater where she held so many early classes. I remember tortilla soup dinners round the big table and our summer parties in the yard with trellis. Enthusiastic gardener, eyes on the beauties, remember how delicately she could show off a flower, those no-nonsense hands. And she was on stage at the Bijou, and she was teaching with no fancy degrees, going on nerve, instinct, years of accumulated experience of attention. Student briefly at New College, Robert Duncan believed in her, supported her. He was the closest thing to a mentor in this kind of experimental educational setting. He could talk all night, and she was the brilliant autodidact, a phenomenal reader. He told me how happy she had found her artistic home, Robert did, and she was great thorn in the side of many things conventional, trying to create a fully accredited academic institution. Lots of faculty meetings that she could derail. You would go through some strange explanation with its obligatory red tape, and she would traipse it right back at you, convoluted stranger. Remember once Reed had to get up, just leave the room. Bobbie was just derailing everything, and he walked around the campus and then came back, and she was still holding forth. And there was her voice that was legendary outside the Kerouac School hub all over town. So the little footnote, because there's a lot of talk of how, the struggle, being a woman writer, somebody who was shutting her down. I never understand what men want with the fleshly muse, drudge and toil of body, ownership. Creeley's love poems are often stunning, but not because he had wrong-headed muse idea. They could have happened without it. He's a wonderful, conscious poet. Is the muse not in the syllables, or does she only reside in bed and kitchen? There wasn't room for more than one poet in the house, and one with fame. I witnessed this commentary and rage in spacious Bolinas, ego, jealousy, phases of a marriage in an earlier socially conditioned binary. What marvelous collaborators they might have been. So Bobbie had to hide the goods and live on pins and needles, was exhausted with sly hiddenness, full-time mother, and keeping up as famous, gorgeous, couple in the world, and she charmed it. She had phenomenal wit and purpose, stories to tell. She could finally breathe at Naropa's Kerouac School, though, and pass on her gnosis to younger writers interested in the sentence and the story and performance of voice, be in community. And her life was source for novels, her uniqueness of lived pedagogy. She had to write or perish. Get on with it, she said. I have sympathy in many directions. They stayed friends and in conversation, and Bob's dear family coming after could also understand the nuances of the difficult lives artists have to forge in identity, agency, individuation. Penelope and Bob raised a wonderful feminist son named Will. The struggle women especially had. Robert Duncan had a profoundly different sense of muse than that of the guys, perhaps because he identified as gay and gave Bobbie a cheer. The thought that was called Helen is her brilliant, exalting breakthrough poem. He noticed, still a work in parody, her work, her life, with more struggle and progress to come. We can't go back now. And this was just a few lines. Bobbie, minutes last at her atrium door, knew we'd not see each other again, tacit, machine hollow, breathing under, screen mute with overblown images, the tacky evildoers, lost souls of media's insinuating drip. That's what she said, they're so tacky. Windblown world's indifference, knack of deference, she's so smart inside, it's harder to be that clever. Bobbie's new haircut, a whistle to her senses, thin wrists, we knew what it was. Evil empire, what got's taken over. The new had some years, oh, what a time. What a way to say goodbye, world in tatters. Knew it such, not the mad ones. We aren't, she said, I'm tired. Not make it much longer. Her rage was critical, diamond, Vajra anger. Ah, those idiots, no pity, sentimentality, what have we got to? Tough, still in beauty and smile, but to eye, it was all heart. Yes, I see you. I know, I see you. Can't, won't act like it's the end, but I see you. Oh, honey, get on home. Okay, I think that's it, and there's some more to see Bobbie. Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Laura. Great.
Mouth tastes a bitter taste. Face grows dark. It is the other bitter side, the exile we live our lives in. How can we bear it? All of us who know more than we know and move in that correctness beyond ourselves. Walking the ground past falls away. Footprints fade in rhythms we have no eye to catch. There was never a way back, never, ever a way back. Every time, all along, no way back. The ways have faded all away, and we're left here in this far region, distant strangers among the most ordinary turns of mind, and where the shape of loss is clear, there is a seepage there of fear that fills the shape. As on the beach, footprints fill with water at our backs, the history, a lengthening graph of small lakes, shaped each one like a foot to fit a foot, and fades. Courage grows so weary. How can we bear it? The skies above, the eyes below, the endless view in mind, distance and going, our familiar place. We name this journey home. We keep ourselves in mind and moving.
Thank you again to all of the readers. Thank you to Lost and Found, and also to Laura Henriksen, who a few people mentioned has a wonderful piece out in LitHub about Bobbie. We have so much material and the great privilege of finding new ways and new readers with whom to share it. So thank you. Good night.